All right. If you want to make your way back to your seats this morning, great to see you all. Glad you're here with us. Welcome to those of us joining online. Glad to have you with us as well. And I hope you're all doing well this morning. If you're new here, would you grab one of the cards and the seat backs in front of you that say new here? I'd love the opportunity to get to know you and maybe take you out to a cup of coffee if you want and just answer any questions you have. If you're online and you're new, feel free to connect with us that way, and I'd love the chance to meet you and talk with you. And then, of course, if you'd like to continue worshiping the Lord through your giving, that is so important for the life of our church, but also for your own life, to learn to give to the Lord sacrificially. And so you can do that online at hrcc.church, or you can drop those in the boxes here in person if you have cash or a check or whatever. So, all right. So I'm going to ask you to be honest here. There's no shame. I'm just curious. How many of you have ever actually read the book of Habakkuk in the Bible? Well, okay, that's a lot more than I thought. Have you really? Okay. How many of you have read the book of Habakkuk in the last 5 years? All right. If you have, then you're going to get some bonus points today. It means nothing, but kudos to you. If you haven't, I'm not surprised, because Habakkuk like something crazy is happening. Thought there were UFOs landing. Sorry, if you're online, there's a bunch of motorcycles going by. All right, if you haven't read it, I'm not that surprised, because it's an out-of-the-way little book of the Bible with kind of a weird title. And in an intimidating section of the Bible, the prophets can be kind of intimidating for us to approach and try to read, I think. But over the next few weeks, I think that you are probably going to fall in love with this little book. So today we're beginning a new series where we're going to be walking through this book of Habakkuk. And we're not going to be walking very far in this one today, though. It's going to be a lot more like we're going to just kind of sit right down in it. Now, I didn't plan it this way, but Habakkuk is kind of the perfect follow-up to our message from last week. If you weren't here and we weren't online because we had a little problem with the sound, you could see me, you just couldn't hear me. So if you're a lip reader, you're good. But if you weren't here, we talked about how to live in the long middle, in the unnarrated day-to-day waiting of our lives. What to do when God seems silent. How to deal with a God that you believe and know to be good, but who sure looks bad sometimes. And the lesson from Joseph's life last week was, in those times, to stay faithful and faith-filled. That's how he walked through the long middle. And Habakkuk was certainly those things. But he's going to take us to even greater depths than Joseph did. He's going to challenge everything that we think we know about God. And he's not just going to show us an example of how to live when God seems distant or silent. He's going to teach us how to pray. You see, Habakkuk is a book of prayer. It's listening in on a conversation between the prophet and God. And in this prayer, there's more going on than what you might suspect at first. Now, as I said, we are going to sit right down in Habakkuk's opening prayer this morning. A prayer that I would guess most of us have probably never been taught to pray. That some of us might think we're not even allowed to pray. A prayer that flies in the face of so much Christian rhetoric about prayer that you might hear on like Christian radio or read at a Christian bookstore or whatever. A prayer of lament. Now, a lament is a structured form of prayer in the Bible that expresses deep sorrow or pain or even a grievance to God. We see lament in the Psalms. We see it throughout the prophets, including here in Habakkuk. And oh, by the way, there's also an entire book of the Bible called Lamentations. Jesus prayed a lament in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Bible is full of examples of lament as a valid, God-approved way to pray. Yet, in our modern context, it feels like maybe we've kind of lost the art of lament somewhere along the way. It's easy for me to understand why I think that we've lost some of the prayer of lament. For one thing, it's kind of just countercultural to sort of our moment right now, where the primary message of our culture is that we're supposed to be winning all the time, and positive and triumphant attitudes are held up as desire examples. We're supposed to crush it every day and rise and grind and always be making gains, right? There's this intense social pressure to present a well-curated, positive image of ourselves, to always let the world know that we're thriving and living our best lives. Add to that the hyper-individuality of our culture, where everyone is supposed to be in control of their own destiny and just reliant upon themselves and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And we've become culturally uncomfortable with sharing grief and sadness and mourning with those who mourn. We've also made a cultural shift that has been radically accelerated by 24/7 news and social media to react to tragedies and injustice in a way that skips right over grief and goes straight to outrage. So rather than exploring our emotions and bringing them to God honestly, we more often react to our emotions and bring them hastily to a platform. We've also become increasingly uncomfortable with mystery. We believe that everything must be knowable and explainable and able to be mastered. So the idea of confronting a benevolent God with suffering and living with the tension of unanswered questions becomes difficult to undertake. But I think, by far, the main reason that we don't pray this way is because it goes against so much of our own messaging. We're supposed to be blessed, right? We're supposed to be joyful and triumphant. And in Christian circles, deep sorrow and grief and anguish might often be met with admonitions to just have faith, to be unshakable, to stop doubting God. Lament even feels contrary to so many of the sound bites from Scripture that we hear preached way more often. Like when James says that we should pray, when we pray, we must believe and not doubt, that the prayer of faith will make the sick person well, and that the prayer of a righteous person is powerfully effective. Paul instructed, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, right? Jesus himself repeatedly talked about praying with faith and not doubting and believing that we've received what we've asked for. So the idea of lament, coming to God angry and with questions and hurting and grieved, accusing him of not keeping up his end of the bargain, that feels contrary to everything we think we know about prayer. But what if we've been wrong about the fundamental assumption that lies beneath all of that? The cultural resistance, the uncomfortability, the Christian platitudes, the seemingly contradictory scriptures, they all rest on the same assumption: that lament is weakness, that lament is doubt, that lament and faith are two opposite ends of a spectrum. If I have doubts and struggle with the mystery of God, then I must be a disappointment to him. If I'm not certain, then I'm living a lie. If I question God, then I must not have enough faith. And today, my hope is that we can see that assumption for what it is, which is false. And that instead, we can replace it with the truth. That lament is not what happens when your faith is broken. Lament is what happens when you are broken, but your faith is not. Now, before we even get into Habakkuk's prayer, we need to orient ourselves to where we are in the story. So Habakkuk was written in the late 600s BC under Jehoiakim's reign in Judah. He was a contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah, with both of them prophesying in Judah in the same environment and to the same corruption and moral collapse. The kingdom had been subjected to generation after generation of increasingly evil kings. God's people, his special possession, had become a shadow of its former glory. We're talking child sacrifice and idol worship and sorcery and murder and oppression and injustice of every kind that had become the norm in Israel and Judah. Now, a couple of decades before Habakkuk, the temple was under some repairs, and a book of the law, which was probably Deuteronomy, was found and read to the then king Josiah. And upon hearing it, he was overcome with grief at what had become of God's people. He tore his clothes. He committed to the greatest renewal and religious reform movement Judah had ever seen. He reestablished the Passover for the first time in centuries. But in 609 BC, while fighting to keep the Egyptians from moving north to support the collapsing Assyrian Empire, Josiah was killed in battle. Now, he was proof that Judah could return to God, but with him dead, the reforms that he instated started immediately coming unraveled. The Pharaoh at the time in Egypt installed Josiah's evil son Jehoiakim as his puppet king in Judah after getting rid of Josiah's other son so there would be no competition. Jehoiakim reversed his father's reforms. He built pagan altars and brought back idol worship. He built lavish palaces with forced unpaid labor. He corrupted the courts and sold justice to the highest bidder. He persecuted and executed God's prophets. He changed political allegiance from Egypt to Babylon and then back to Egypt, which later prompted Babylon to return and crush them. Habakkuk prophesies under this king. The violence, the injustice, the oppression that he cries out against is because of Jehoiakim. Where can the faithful go for justice when there is no justice? Where can they take their grievances when their king is the source of their grievances? What does a nation do when its king preys on the people rather than protects them? And Judah's internal struggles weren't the only pressure that was working here on Habakkuk. The geopolitical environment was in total upheaval too. For like 300 years prior to this, the Assyrians had been the world's dominant superpower, but their empire was crumbling. The Egyptians tried to come in and ally with them and make a last stand against this oncoming Babylonian storm, but it was no use. And Babylon swept through Judah and Jerusalem surrendered without any resistance at all. Judeans were already being deported to Babylon. So like Daniel and his friends, that's already happened when Habakkuk writes this. And Jehoiakim becomes Babylon's vassal. So to recap, in his lifetime, And really just in the last 10 years before Habakkuk is writing this book, he has seen the world's greatest superpower fall, another even more brutal superpower take its place, his king die in the crossfire, Egypt conquer Judah, then Babylon conquer Egypt, and therefore Judah, his nation is collapsed, and his friends and his countrymen are being marched off in chains to a foreign land. So when we find him at the beginning of this book, he's between this first wave of deportations and a next bigger one that's coming, the exile that you've heard about. He's seen the kind of brutality and evil that the Babylonians are capable of, and it's only a matter of time before they come back again and finish the job. And Judah's own king is making everything worse. When Habakkuk cries out to God, it's not only because he is personally grieved, although he is. It's because he's literally watching his world crumble all around him. He prays on behalf of a people who are in desperate need, and they have no one to save them. Now, Habakkuk's situation is likely much more extreme than what you and I are probably facing in our lives today, I hope. But the emotions at work are very familiar. I know that there are people in this room this morning who feel like you've been watching the world crumble all around you. Everywhere we look, on the news and on our feeds, we see violence and corruption and oppression all around. New enemies and powers are rising and falling. Nations are warring against nations. Kings are preying upon and oppressing their own people. Even within the borders of our own nation, it can be easy to see moral collapse and corruption and deceit and violence against us. And these are signs that the darkness of the world isn't only something that's out there, it's already here too. And then bringing things home to where you live. Maybe your family situation has been in turmoil. Maybe your relationships are strained. Things aren't turning out how you always hoped they would be. Maybe you've been hit by challenge after challenge and you just feel like you're drowning. You're fighting a losing battle to keep your head above the water. Maybe your career has gone off track, or your workplace has turned into a place of pain and fear. You're not sure how much longer you can go on, but you're also not seeing many prospects elsewhere. Maybe you're carrying the weight of financial responsibilities that you can't seem to keep up with, and that weight is crushing you. Maybe you feel like things should have been different. And in moments when you allow yourself to be really honest, you might even feel like God hasn't held up his end of the deal with you. Maybe you've given up on praying because you just can't fake the prayers that you've been taught to sound like faith anymore. Then Habakkuk's prayer is for you. And if you walked into this room this morning feeling like God is mostly done with you, or like you can't really say what you need to say because it will be too much for God to handle, allow Habakkuk to show you that God is big enough to handle whatever you can throw at him. And give yourself the permission to come back to God again in lament. Let's read our text together this morning. Habakkuk says, "How long, Lord, must I cry for help? But you do not listen. I call out to you, violence, but you do not intervene. Why do you force me to witness injustice? Why do you put up with wrongdoing? Destruction and violence confront me. Conflict is present, and one must endure strife. For this reason, the law lacks power, and justice is never carried out. Indeed, the wicked intimidate the innocent, and for this reason, justice is perverted. Now, the biblical prayer of lament is a structured prayer with identifiable elements. And typically, they include address, complaint, question, appeal, and then a turn. And Habakkuk's prayer here is a textbook case in some of those, and it's surprising in the way it handles others. So first, Habakkuk addresses his prayer to the Lord, which if you look in your Bible is in all caps or small caps. Literally just Yahweh. How long, Yahweh? Habakkuk is not just shouting into the void. He's not just venting his frustrations to no one in particular. He invokes Yahweh by his covenant name. When the prophet appeals to Yahweh, he's addressing the God who revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush, the God who delivered his handwritten decrees on Sinai and made an everlasting covenant with his people, the God who made specific promises about justice and protection. And then we have the complaint. How long? How long, Yahweh? Must I cry for help? But you're not listening. I cry out to you, violence. You're not doing anything about it. This is a desperate cry from a man who feels like God has gone silent. I wonder how many of you feel like you could relate to that this morning. How long, Lord? I am hurting. I'm tired. I'm doing everything I know how to do. But things don't seem to be getting any better. And I can't seem to find you in it. How long am I going to have to wait? How long until you do something? How long until you heal? How long until you save? How long until you show me the way or speak to me or ease this suffering? How long? Let's just admit this morning that that is a difficult prayer to pray. It feels too bold. How dare I suggest that God isn't doing something that I think he should be doing, or that God has wronged me in some way? That can't be okay, can it? Well, Habakkuk isn't backing down. When he says, I cry out, violence, that's much more than him just being grieved or concerned about violence that's happening around him. It is a legal charge. The Hebrew word there is Hamas, not to be confused with the organization Hamas, which is a different meaning in Arabic. It's the same sound, but it's a different word. But in Hebrew, Hamas was a cry of legal protest. It would be shouted publicly, like at a city gate, and it summoned judicial intervention from the judge and obligated the witnesses around to testify in the case. Crying out Hamas was the way to file a legal judicial case in the court. So when Habakkuk says, I cry out violence, he's saying that he's been filing a legal claim and asking God to fulfill his obligation as the judge to bring justice where there is none. Yet look at the response. You do not listen. You do not intervene. Habakkuk is accusing God of something. Society has been committing Hamas all around him, and he has filed the charge in God's courtroom, and God is sitting at his judicial bench refusing to rule or even hear the case. Sit with that for a minute. Now, have you ever prayed like that? But he's not even done yet. Because then he brings his questions and he makes his case against the Lord. Why do you force me to witness injustice? Why do you put up with wrongdoing? Notice that Habakkuk never accuses God of directly perpetrating evil, but he sure does accuse him of being indirectly responsible. The implication to what he's saying is that if God would have done what he ought to be doing, Habakkuk wouldn't have been forced to see such terrible injustice. And he's speaking on behalf of the people. It's because God has seemingly put up with wrongdoing that things in Judah have now gone completely off the rails. He never leaves any room for the idea that God is incapable of delivering justice and dealing with evil. That's why he brings the question in the first place. You could, but you just won't. And isn't that a much more difficult question to wrestle with? So destruction and violence have become unavoidable. Conflict and strife is happening all around. The general order of society has completely broken down. And for this reason, Habakkuk says, the law has lost its power. Depending on what translation you read, it might say the law has been paralyzed or the law is numb. This is interesting. Mainly because Habakkuk is unknowingly looking forward to the problem that Jesus will one day come to solve. That without God's direct intervention and administration of justice, the law is insufficient to save people from themselves. Law and order only work if they are ultimately backed by God himself. And if he refuses to act, and if evil people keep getting the upper hand, and the law can't do anything to restrain or contain them, then what incentive is there for anyone to obey? Haven't we seen that pattern be true in our own age among the nations of this world? There is no amount of legislation that can restrain mankind's insatiable appetite for evil. In the absence of God, society will always become increasingly chaotic, increasingly violent, increasingly unjust. Now, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul will use Habakkuk's complaint as the exact diagnosis of the insufficiency of the law to save. In the face of overwhelming violence and injustice, only an act of God can overcome it. If Habakkuk's complaint is that God is not doing anything to punish the wicked, Paul's reading turns that kind of on its head, and he says that God's inaction is itself the judgment. That the punishment for sin is sin and its consequences. But where does that leave the righteous remnant? Does God not distinguish between the righteous and the evil? Both Paul and Habakkuk will have a lot more to say on that subject, but we're not there yet. All we know now is the thrust of Habakkuk's case. That humanity has gone completely bankrupt, and Torah alone is powerless to do anything about it. God must intervene. But as far as Habakkuk can see, he just won't. Which brings us to the place that makes Habakkuk unique among biblical examples of lament. Because the next movement is typically a request or an appeal for Yahweh to do something, and then a turn towards an expression of trust or praise or thanksgiving. And Habakkuk gives us neither. In Habakkuk, the appeal is never made explicit. He doesn't ask God to do anything specific. There's no, arise, O Lord, hear my pleas, respond to my call. Habakkuk never makes that turn here. And at first glance, it sure reads like the prayer of a man who has lost his faith. Habakkuk doesn't seem like he believes that God will intervene. He seems like he's given up all hope that God will stop this madness. His society is falling apart. There's no justice to be found in the courts. The Torah is incapable of bringing people back to order. The situation is desperate and hopeless. Habakkuk never explicitly makes his appeal or request to God, and he for sure doesn't turn to praise and trust. Not here, at least. Eventually he will, spoiler alert, but not yet. For now, all he can do is just state his case and drop it at God's feet. And maybe that does mean that Habakkuk has lost his faith in that moment. But I don't think it does. Yes, the situation seems hopeless. Yes, the nation is in utter chaos. Yes, the leadership is in bed with their enemies. Yes, the king is preying upon his own people. The law has lost its power and bitten its own tongue. And so far, God hasn't seemed to care or do anything about it. But Habakkuk is still talking to him anyway. And here's the question that I'd like for you to consider today. What if, in the middle of your suffering, in the middle of your waiting, in the middle of your pain, when it feels like all you have are questions and you never get any answers, when it feels like God has gone silent and like he's not doing anything to fix your situation, what if the very act of bringing your charge and your complaint against God, of being vulnerable enough to lay it all out on the table, of returning to him one more time and crying out, "How long, Lord?" What if that is the most faith-filled prayer you can possibly pray? Because it's easy for me to believe that God is with me and for me and that he will answer my prayers when I'm walking in his miracles. It's much harder to believe that when I'm sitting in his silence. What if the very fact that you're still talking to him is the evidence of your faith? Because you don't ask, "How long?" to a God you don't believe will respond. You don't ask, "Where are you?" to a God that you don't believe can be found. You don't charge God with inaction if you don't believe that you can provoke his intervention. You don't present him with evidence that seems contrary to his character if you don't believe that he will prove his character to be true. You don't accuse him of breaking his promise if you don't believe that he will rise up and keep them. You see, I don't think that Habakkuk's lack of a request to God was a failure of his faith. I think that his request was already implicit in every desperate word that he prayed. And some of you here probably need to be reminded of this today, that God is big enough to handle all of your complaints, all of your fears, all of your worries, all of your pain, all of your struggle, and all of your tears, even when they're against him. And the very act of bringing them to him and laying them at his feet is all the faith you need. Because lament is not what happens when your faith is broken. Lament is what happens when you are broken, but your faith is not. And today, Habakkuk is giving you an invitation to allow yourself to recover the lost art of lament. I know that there are people all over this room who are experiencing intense seasons of struggle right now. Your mental health is shattered. Your family is a train wreck. Your finances look hopeless. Your loved ones are sick. Your marriage is in trouble. Your career is in shambles. You're burnt out. You're exhausted. And worst of all, it seems like God is silent. You're not alone in this. Maybe you feel like you've been struggling to believe. Well, I'm about to give you an invitation to lament. But before we do, I just want to warn you about one more thing. Because praying a prayer of lament is a risky prayer. Daring God to respond is not for the faint of heart. This is not a faithless prayer. It is a prayer that requires all the faith you have. Because if you pray this way, you have to be willing to face the reality that God still might not answer you the way that you want him to. And then what are you going to do with that? Next week, we're going to see how God responded to this prayer from Habakkuk. And you're probably going to wish that we had just stayed in the question, because the answer is worse than the problem. What I really think is that most of us pray small, safe prayers, if we even pray at all, to protect ourselves from being disappointed by God. We don't actually trust him with our lives, so we don't pray in a way that allows him to surprise us. But a prayer of lament is a big prayer. It takes guts to go toe-to-toe with the God of the universe. But maybe you'll find that if you do, you'll stop trying to control God by keeping him small and praying small, containable prayers that shrink him down to your size. And instead, you'll give him the chance to surprise you by catching you up in the story that's his size. And so if you're one of those people who's in that season of struggle and waiting and silence, if you found yourself identifying with Habakkuk today, whether you've ever prayed in this way in your life or not, I want to give you the invitation to join Habakkuk and David and Solomon and the prophets and Jesus himself and pray a lamenting prayer today. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to pray the first part of Habakkuk's lament together corporately. And then I'm going to just give you a few minutes while they sing to respond and lament individually. And as you do, remember the structure of a biblical lament. The address, you address the God who created you, made you for purpose, and has made an everlasting covenant of life through the blood of Christ with you. Complaint, tell God everything that is coming against you, including the things that you perceive that he has done or not done. Question, ask him the hardest questions, the ones that you've dared not even utter before. Appeal, Ask him to do something about it if you want to. But remember, the very act of saying the prayer is itself an ask. And then turn to trust. If you're able, you can praise him, because even when all the evidence seems otherwise, he can be trusted with your life and your family and your circumstances. But you don't have to feel the pressure to fake that this morning. Habakkuk didn't make that turn in this opening prayer. The rest of the book is him working that turn out. Maybe you're able to come to a place of praise this morning. If you are, then praise him. But maybe you need another week or 2 or 3 to make that turn. That's allowed too. The important thing is that you just pray. So, can we stand together this morning as we prepare our hearts to pray along with Habakkuk? Let's read this together out loud. How long, O Lord, come on, read it. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere, I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? And now, allow yourself to respond by letting him hear your cry of lament as they sing, and then we'll come back and close in prayer together.